Before the story continues, this is part 2 of Silent Katana. If this is your first time here, I recommend beginning with part 1, The Return of Silence, so you may follow the journey from its first step. For those who have already walked that path, welcome back.
Exile did not begin with a door closing. It began with a road, pale under winter light, lifting and falling like a quiet breath. Takeshi and Nobu walked that breath in steady measure, the older stride deliberate, the younger matched to it without forcing. Snow had thinned to gray seams in the ditches, and where the wind had its habit, a fine sifting of ash drifted across the path, soft as flour on a board. The land where smoke the way cloth wears a memory faded, stubborn, woven into. The fibers so thoroughly that water cannot fully wash it out. They came upon the first village at mid-morning, not by surprise, but by the slow arrival of its signs. A fence in half collapse, a line of willow stumps charred and still exhaling the faint, sweet smell of burned sap, a shrine's fieldstone wet with thaw, where soot had made a finger's print and then been smeared by snow. Crows circled at a respectful height, black calligraphy on a pale page, their voices dry and spare, never lingering over any one syllable. Takeshi stepped around a beam fallen across the path, its joints blackened to the color of old tea, that pegs inside showing themselves like bones asked to say what held them once. The houses had opened into their ribs. Roofs lay like punctured sails, tiles scattered and glazed with frost. Where sliding doors had been, charred rails pointed to a space the weather now owned. At a threshold, a pair of sandals had fused into one shape, straw and soot married by heat, the cord between them stiff and useless. A story stopped mid-sentence. Wind moved through the rooms without asking permission, lifting ash, laying it down, drawing faint eddies that found corners and made them darker. Nobu halted at a well. The pulley above it was a ring of black, rope burned in two where a hand might have been a moment too late. He peered in. Water held the sky's thin gray, unbroken. A single leaf, preserved by cold, floated near the stone wall, held in place by some small decision the air had made. He let the bucket down slowly with the line they had brought, wood touching water with a sound so clean it almost felt new. When he drew it up, the smell carried a ghost of smoke from the stones. He held the bucket between them. Drink? He offered. Takeshi took the ladle. We will, he said. They drank with the same restraint the well had kept all winter. The water pinned a taste of iron against the tongue and then released it. Nobu wound the line neatly, the small work correct and dignified in a place where a large work had failed. Beyond the houses, patties lay black and flat, the field walls softened by melt. Charred stubble made a regiment of small spears pointing nowhere. In the middle of one square, a scarecrow's pole had burned down to the height of a child's shoulder. On it, the sleeve of an old robe fluttered, torn to a narrow tongue, lifting and falling without sound. The smell of smoke lived low to the ground and rose when a step bothered it, a breath returning to the nose as if reminding it what it already knew. They moved through without counting. Takeshi's eye noted what the path always teaches when it has been punished, where men had run and where they had turned. Where a bundle had been set down with care even in haste. Where someone had gone back for a small thing that had no value but weight. Under the beam of a fallen house, a bowl lay unbroken, rim just visible above ash. Nobu knelt, brushed it clean, and set it on the doorsill as if the house might return later and be glad not to search. Farther on, a bell that had hung beneath an eave lay in the lane, its lip cracked, the fracture white. He touched it with his knuckle and chose not to make it sound. The silence in the village was larger than any tone, layered and exact, measured out by what remained. To add a note would have been like placing bright paint on a scroll, already complete in ink. Was this the northern line? Nobu asked quietly. Takeshi shook his head. "The line moves with hunger," he said. "It will have this, and then another place, and then another." They walked on. The road lifted them gently toward low wooded hills where smoke gathered in the lee like a tired mind. At day's end, in the trees, ash rested on the needles and then slid off in half-coherent sheets when wind made a careful decision to wake a branch. Here and there, trunks were scorched to the height of a man, above which green continued, a tree's refusal to let heat define it. In a ditch, a suit of lamellar lay unstrung, plates warped and separated, their lace burned to fine wire. Nobu crouched and ran a finger over one plate. The metal skin lifted flakes like winter on old paint. "Leave it," Takeshi said. Nobu you did, not out of fear of weight, but out of respect for the order that had failed to keep it bound. He stood and brushed his finger against his trousers, leaving a small black arc. The shape looked like a note and meant nothing except that the day remembered him. Toward noon, they came to a farmhouse by itself, the kind a family builds when it wishes to be both among its neighbors and, in some parts of the day, away. The house had opened like a book dropped in fire, its spine twisted, its pages curled. The inner posts stood, blackened, drying in the brittle cold. An oil jar lay on its side, unbroken, its mouth packed with ash as if to hold in what might escape. Near it, marks in the hard ground suggested where a pot had been snatched quickly from heat, leaving a clean ring. The ring had caught a little ash and become a charcoal-sketched moon dot. Takeshi crossed the yard to the paddies behind. On the far bank, under the pale frame of a quince tree, he stopped. A sash of red cloth, weathered to brick and soot, lay under a scatter of broken reed mats. He drew it out with care. The knot at one end was familiar. The same hand that tied it had taught his own fingers where to find the turn and the bite. He did not hold it up to the light. He folded it once, twice, set it on the low wall, and rested his palm on it. The cloth took on a degree of warmth it could not keep. He left it where others might find it if searching, a signal set not to call back the lost, but to say, here was life. Crows circled above the paddies and then moved on. Their wings made no sound the ear could carry. The wind shifted and brought a fresher smell the river had, burning partially behind a stand of poplar where someone had overturned a brazier and left it. The smoke was thin now, the incident old enough to be done with shouting. They continued toward it, feet sinking to ankle and thawed margin, the ground letting them go only after an argument that never rose to anger. At the river, there was ice along both banks in broken plates, each piece beveled by sun. In the shallows, reed heads had burned into black feathers that kept their shape and gave up nothing to the water. A plank bridge, singed, held with iron straps that had blued in heat and then returned to dullness, spanned the slow flow. In the middle of it, someone had drawn with bare finger and set two lines crossing where a seal might sit, the strokes blurred by the heel of a palm. Nobu looked at it and then at Takeshi. Takeshi reached into his sleeve and took out a fold of paper. He laid the paper over the mark and pressed once, as if to accept its insistence without granting it permanence, then tucked the paper away where it would remain without calling attention to itself. "Eat?" Nobu asked. "Soon," Takeshi said. They took the far bank at a place where willow roots had held on. The land sloped up, ash lifting from the path in little puffs that drifted like insects. The afternoon softened to that pellucid hour when light thins and edges clap themselves shut in anticipation of dusk. The air grew colder, and with it, the smoke scent sharpened, less sweet, more iron. Their breath shortened and steadied. When they spoke again, it was only to remind the body that it could share weight. "Here," Nobu said when the road offered an opening between a couple of pines and a low stone wall, the remains of a garden. "For night," Takeshi nodded. The walls still did the work the family had asked of it breaking wind. keeping out stray dogs, giving a place for a child to sit and watch hens. Inside, the ground was scraped to dark where snow had melted and run under the wall in small tongues. A trellis had fallen, its lattice making a patient geometry on the earth, ash in every square as if someone had shaken out an apron. At the garden's far end, half hidden by boards, a clay cistern held a disk of ice thin as a window. Nobu tapped it with a knuckle. The surface gave a clean note, a simple vowel. They set their small camp with the economy that had become their birth. Coat and mat rolled out under the lee of the wall. A pot hung low over a handful of coals, captured from a coal bag. Water measured, rice given to it like a steady thought. Wood here was not plentiful and not dry. Takeshi and Nobu gathered what the place offered dead fine. A stick from the trellis broken at a joint, a fallen beam's splintered end that, under its black crust, still remembered the pail of new split grain. They shaved a little bark to coax a flame. The shavings curled and took, and the tiny fire began without sound, wreathing their careful hands in smoke that made their sleeves share the day's smell. They ate without ceremony, each mouthful a fact. The rice tasted faintly of the pot's iron and the wood's past. Nobu set the two bowls to warm near the coals for a little longer after they had finished, then rinsed them with a measured splash and turned them upside down. He set the chopsticks in a cross without remark, a habit that had started the day the fortress gate closed behind them. The gesture felt like a small roof over the meal's spirit. The crows had gone. In their place, the wind made a lower speech along the patties, finding the broken stalks and passing over them like a hand passing over a quiet head. The smell of smoke deepened in the chill. From time to time, a gust lifted ash from the ruin of a roof tile and drew it past the camp in a flock of gray moths. The world drew itself in, closing shutters, pulling doors, laying mats back on the floor, not because it feared, but because it knew the shape of evening. Nobu unrolled his bedding and adjusted it so that the wall's shadow met the mat at a diagonal, leaving his face in open air. He glanced at the farmhouse's skeleton and then away. "There will be others," he said softly. Takeshi looked into the embers and did not answer. The fire's small heart confessed its orange and hid the white where it was hottest. Smoke lifted in thin, reflective ribbons that made a mirror of darkness, a mirror without glass. In that mirror, Kazuo arrived not as a shape, but as warmth hand heavy on a shoulder once, breath visible on a winter road, the minor habit of tightening a strap twice when once would have done. The smoke folded and moved. The ember's skin cracked and slid, exposing a brighter thought for a breath, and then crusting over again. He saw, not with eyes, the close set of his brother's mouth when patience was called for, and the way that set could soften when a child showed him something small, a beetle, a berry, a stone rubbed flat by the river. The reflection was not magic. It was snow and ash, fire and dark, memory and the habit of a heart that had learned where to keep such things. Nobu lay back and looked at the strip of sky above the wall. Stars were late, the thin cloud having yet to clear. The first appeared, by agreement rather than by entrance. "We will mend what can be mended," he said, barely more than breath. "We will walk," Takeshi replied, "and watch, and carry." They let quiet return. The ruins clicked and settled as wood cools. A spar somewhere under the heap adjusted and found a better angle. The patties answered night the way they answered day by accepting it. The path they had taken into the village did not ask for a name. The smell of smoke in the soil reached them and stayed, a low ribbon that would not be lifted until rain came in earnest, and even then it would linger, ink in the paper. A distant dog barked once and reconsidered. The river, nowhere near, told. No story they could hear. Takeshi fed the coals with 3 more thin sticks. each placed as if aligning two pieces of an argument that did not need to be one. The flame licked and retreated, content to work at the edges. He leaned his back to the wall and let the cold of stone meet the heat of his chest's slow work. Between the two, he found a place that felt like honesty. The embers narrowed their glow to a handful of small eyes, then widened again when wind found them. The smoke made its mirror. Kazuo's head turned a fraction as if to hear something approaching from behind, and then the ribbon split and rejoined, laying over the embers with a gentleness that felt like a hand placed on a table between brothers with nothing more to add. Pressed down but did not oppress. It had its weight, heavier than a battle, quieter than a court. The land held its ash and did not ask for pity. Takeshi closed his eyes and saw the path as a gray thread stretched across a page no longer blank. He let his breath slow until it matched the coal's soft pulse. Nobu's breathing answered from the mat, even trustworthy. The farmhouse's ribs made their black geometry against the sky. Somewhere beyond, crows had found their rest on a leafless tree and tucked their heads without forgetting. The fire subsided to a red that eye can keep without fatigue. In the last low light, in the small smoke that remained faithful to its line, Kazuo's presence lingered, no words, no commands, only a steady regard that made the road feel more narrow and more sure at once. Takeshi sat with it until the cold asked him to lie down. He eased beside the banked glow and drew his cloak close. The embers answered with one slow breath, then another. The ruins around them did not forget. The night settled into its work, and the silence took the measure of two men sleeping where a family had once slept, heavier than any battle because it asked nothing and permitted everything to be remembered. Dawn unfolded without color, a pale cloth pulled over the fields. The ruins around the garden wall gave back only the sounds a morning can spare, a beam settling by a finger's width, a gust lifting ash and letting it fall, the thin rasp of reeds where frost had lost its grip. Takeshi rose before the light gathered itself, added 2 sticks to the coals with the care a man gives to a sleeping child, and watched their tips begin to glow. Nobu stirred, folded his mat with a measured square of hands, and set the bowls. To catch a little warmth from the revived breath, they ate a simple mouthful, the dry sweetness of rice crisped at its edges, a sip of water that remembered smoke. No words were needed. The land itself spoke in short sentences, wind through a broken sill, a crow calling twice and then nowhere, the small, dry clink of a tile nudged by thaw. When they stepped back onto the road, their prints overlapped yesterday's, as if to confirm that going on often resembles going back, only with more of the world inside the body. Ash drifted in light flurries, turning ditches into soft gray rivers that moved without leaving. A mile beyond the village, a low ridge of pines shouldered the sky. From behind it came a smoke that belonged to a fire still tended, a thicker, denser brown, with a line that bent where someone had added wood and then waited. Takeshi paused, listening with more than ears. The wind brought other proofs. Sag, thin and warmed, dried fish softened over steam, oil on iron, the faint metal squeak of an old strap, the ghost of singing wire, a shamisen string tested and allowed a note. They followed the ridge around its shoulder and found the clearing by degrees. First, a banner tattered to a fringe, its faded crest half swallowed by wind. Then a blade leaning against a stump, its handle wrapped in cloth that had been replaced 3 times and would be replaced again. Then faces turned toward that. Newcomers and turned away men who had learned to watch without showing their watching. The camp had arranged itself with a soldier's thrift, bedrolls in a crescent, a common fire sunk into a shallow pit to hide its glow, packs hung from a rope strung between 2 pines to spare them the ground's memory of damp. A small iron pot trembled on stones, and the steam that rose from it carried salted, Fish and old rice into the air with the humility of a meal that asks nothing but to be eaten. Armor clinked in quiet, mismatched as if each piece had drifted here from a different battle, and agreed reluctantly to share a body, a breastplate with a lacquer spiderweb where heat had tried to write on it, sewed borrowed from a cousin, a helmet bowl without a crest, its baldness revealing the dent where a rider's knee once struck. Swords lay within reach, but not in hand. At the fire, a man tuned a shamisen with care, turning a peg until the string's thread of sound slid into line with the day, then stopping. He did not play. He merely let the instrument breathe. The leader did not announce himself. He stood by, standing where decisions must stand, between the fire and the open side of the camp. His face carried the patient geography of years spent on other people's road lines, not of anger, but of looking long, a silvered beard shorn short for neatness rather than display, a scar along the jaw that had found its place and stopped arguing. On his left, the sleeve of his robe had been patched with a square of plain cloth expertly, the stitches small and even. The way he lifted his chin made his name unnecessary. "Travelers," he said, and the word fell like a small rope across a gap. Takeshi inclined his head. "We walk north." "Most who walk," the man said, "do not choose their direction." "Most who stop," Takeshi answered, "do not choose either." A handful of men around the fire allowed the quiet to open, then settle again. One of them drank, the clay cup chipping a thin ring against his teeth. Another loosened the tie around a bracer and retied it to the next hole, his fingers working with more tenderness than the object deserved. The shamisen gave one accidental note, soft as a sparrow's weight on a line, and the player damped the string with the heel of his hand as if to apologize to the air. "Ronin," the leader said, not as a boast or a lament, but as a description a census might accept. "Broken. Banners, kept blades." Nobu glanced up and down the curve of men. Each were a history no single crest could explain, and each let that history settle like ash on the shoulders visible, inevitable, not worth brushing off when wind would only lay more down. He kept his questions behind his teeth and lowered his gaze the way a junior lowers his gaze in a yard, not out of fear, but to give room for the measure of elders. The leader's eyes found the red knot at the guard of Takeshi's short blade, noted it, and did not return. "We have food enough to share if you have silence enough to pay with," he said. "Silence," Takeshi said, "we carry." He and Nobu set their bundles down a respectful distance, neither outside nor within, that careful middle where strangers become less strange. Men made space with the slight shifts soldiers make when a formation must include two more bodies. A bowl moved. A mat was drawn with an edge of a hand. No orders were spoken. The camp adjusted the way a wound adjusts to a salve not healed. But less raw. Fir ilagih moved over faces that knew how to meet it. It found the shine along a scar and made it briefly a river. It caught on a split varnish and turned it to amber. It ran across the metal of a scabbard mouth and left it colder than before. The smell of sake opened itself without insistence, comfort without indulgence. Dried fish lifted from the pot, and a man tore it with 2 thumbs, steam rising in small handles, and passed each half to those nearest as if feeding birds in winter, careful not to favor one over another. "North?" the leader said after a time, the way one asks the weather if it intends to keep its promise. "For a while," Takeshi said, "the line is restless there." Another man offered, not looking up. "It eats, then sleeps, then eats." "Lines?" the leader murmured, "like to think they are rivers." "Rivers," someone farther back said, "do not steal their own banks." The shamisen player, persuaded by the fire and the sake to try the day's first song, set 3 notes in the air and left them there, no melody, only a way of finding out if the evening wanted one. The notes thinned at the edges were cold. Caught them and carried them a short distance into the pines. Wind lifted the tattered banner tied to a low branch and made its fringe. Speaking a language that remembered rain better than blood, Nobu accepted a cup and warmed it with both hands. Before tasting, the sake, thin but clean, set its small heat under the tongue and moved out like a shy guest deciding to meet the room. He looked toward Takeshi, saw the older man accept a piece of rice cake and place it beside him as if promising to eat it. Later, the leader observed both gestures and filed them where such observations are kept. Names, when they came, were offered like pebbles placed on a cairn, small, sufficient not all at once. One man named himself as the son of a dyer who know. Longer died, his palms stained permanently with a blue that would not keep a blade from slipping. Another had been a groom in a house now taken by someone else's banners. He still moved as if every motion should not frighten horses. Another said nothing. He drew his sleeve down over a tattoo at the wrist that looked like a crane's leg, or a river reed, or a line drawn by a bored boy on a day of rain. The leader left his name unspoken and made no work of hiding it. He poured sake for Takeshi with his left hand and for Nobu with his right, and did not drink until both cups were full. "You walked out," he said finally, not a question. "Walls closed behind us." Takeshi said. The leader nodded as if to a familiar story. "We left before the walls remembered our names," he said. After a certain hour, gratitude forgets its handwriting. A soft, dry laughter moved around the circle like a small brush along parchment. No one repeated it. The shamisen tried. A low run of notes that did not quite cohere, then stopped in an honesty that earned him 2 quiet approvals and no teasing. A man near Nobu began to speak in fragments, not because he could not tell a story, but because stories told whole at. "A fire tend to last too long. Snow by the western ford," he said. "We camped in reeds. The Lord's messenger came with a seal, asked for what we had already eaten. We gave him the pot. He thanked us. He did not bring wood. He sipped and let the rest lie. Another added a piece shaped like an arrowhead. At the mill, the miller hid his stones, said he would not grind for thieves. We milled with the heel of our hands. The rice tasted of effort, which is not a bad flavor. On the ridge," the groom said, warming to a memory that had given something back, "a woman led us to water. She did not speak. She pointed. We drank. We left a coin. It fell into the trough. She let it lie. We did not reach in." His eyes watched the fire as if it were a horse telling him whether he had pulled the blanket straight. That Takeshi listened and gave nothing to the pile of small, true stones. Nobu listened with the interest of a student who can hear. Among the low notes, the outline of a form he might one day recognize. He turned his cup in his hands to keep the heat where it would not flee too quickly. When he glanced again at the banner, he noticed a thread of charcoal on its cloth, 2 strokes that crossed into place, where a seal would sit if a seal had been wanted. He did not point. He let his eyes return to the fire and arranged his face as one arranges a mat. The leader's glance met Takeshi's for the length of a breath. Not a challenge, not an invitation, merely a test to see whether both men were reading the same page. Takeshi lowered his gaze. He took the rice cake and ate a piece. Its dry sweetness made the sake teacher of patience rather than friend of appetite. He sensed in the men around him the reliable gravity of loyalty that had lost its object and continued anyway, like a river running in a bed that had shifted but still insisted on the old direction. They were the quiet bitterness of those who have looked too often at orders that forgot who must carry them. They had also kept enough of themselves to share food without counting it twice. Honor here had been simplified to useful shapes: portion, water, watch, blade. A gust came down the hill and shook the pines. The banner lifted and showed in its movement the missing weight where a crest had been cut away. Firelight jumped, and in that jump cheeks hollowed and filled, scars brightened and dinned, eyes changed color and returned. Armor answered the wind. With a dozen small dim clinks, a chorus of old coins in a pouch no one spends from anymore. From the pot, a line of steam went thin and straight and vanished. North, the leader said again, not because he had forgotten, but because the word seemed willing to be weighed once more. We will take that road at dawn. Company may teach the day better manners. Takeshi poured a measure from his cup into the ground, an old habit for missing mouths. We walk lightly, he said. We have no other weight to offer. The boss. Leader replied. Nobu's eyes had the brightness of a hearth made neat at night. He wanted to ask about the western ford, the miller, the woman on the ridge, but instead he said, thank you, because a fire requires gratitude to keep from cooling too fast. We all borrow the same heat, a man said, and eased his legs out of their fold to warm the knees. The shamisen found a line now and drew it without insistence, a few notes that could have been a lullaby if anyone had known the words. A low turn that might have belonged to a field chant once, when hands timed their work to sound. A pause, then the same line again, as if remembering that repetition is the kindest kind of hope. The wind agreed, softened, then stirred the banner. To its quiet prayer, sake cups clicked like soft stones. The fire took one stick, then another. The day let itself darken in a manner that did not ask questions. Around the margins of the clearing, blades rested. Some slept in elaborate scabbards, now dulled to the color of rain. Some went naked to the air, polished so often by cloth that the steel seemed less sharp and more certain. A few handles showed the shine of hands that would not leave them entirely. The smell that rose when someone wiped oil onto a rag was clean and old-fashioned, the scent of craft remembered by fingers. From time to time, a strap was tightened, a knot retied, a buckle slid to a new hole, and each small correction made a sound that taught Nobu what years will do to a man's patience. The leader gestured once, and a roll was fetched an arrow. Bundle of sticks cut in equal lengths, each notched twice. He set them by the fire. For morning, he said. When breath argues with the hour, Nobu smiled and stood to help. He stacked the sticks in a small lattice, each piece treated, as if it could splinter at a look. The leader watched for a moment, then looked away, as if pleased to find the boy's elbows at the right angle. Takeshi, instead, set his cloak more closely at his back and watched the banner until it stilled. The 2 strokes in charcoal were only strokes again. Even so, he felt in the bones the proximity of debts that do not forget which way a man walked. To meet them. Stories continued in fragments, never long enough to become a burden. At the ferry, a monk paid for us, one man said. He said nothing before, nothing after. Another, a lord steward ordered us to leave, then sent his own son with us to the edge of his jurisdiction. He did not argue either way. He feared and he loved. The boy was quiet. Another, we made a roof for an old woman. It was crooked. She praised it. She cried when we left. The tears were equal to the praise. Between these, the shamisen stitched its simple line and tied off where it should. Takeshi kept his words few. When a cup came, he raised it with 2 fingers. When a bowl was offered, he shared it. When a story ended, he acknowledged it without pressing for its beginning. The leader, taking the measure of silence, did not press back. He seemed to understand that men who can speak with care in a ruined province are more valuable than those who speak at all. Night deepened. The clearing became a room whose walls were branches and wind. The fire settled into a lesson of embers, each coal taking a turn as teacher. The banner made a faint brushing sound on its line and slept. The shamisen's last note rested on the lip of the bowl and did not spill. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, a fox moved with the same economy as the men who watched it, leaving a line of 4 small, precise dents in the ash-dusted snow. "You will stay the night," the leader said at last, tone not quite question, not quite command. "We will," Takeshi replied. "Then sit nearer," the man said, "so the wind does not learn your names." Nobu drew their mat to the edge of the heat. He sat with his knees under his chin, eyes wide as a boy at the threshold of an adult's room, not because of marvel, but because of the quiet weight that sat on every shoulder within reach of the flame. He listened as one listens for a pattern. In vain, he found it, lost it, found it again. The men had not met each other in the same battles, but their sentences belonged to the same weather, obligations that changed names and never changed shape, promises that wore out the tongues that made them, loyalties misplaced and kept anyway, like a charm carried by a child who does not know its meaning and refuses to give it up. Takeshi remained still, his silence less a wall than a basin catching. What fell, letting what could be kept rest at the bottom, allowing the rest to pass. He sensed in the ease with which these men shared rice and sake, the equal ease with which a debt might be invoked when dawn came and the road divided. Sensed a ledger he could not see, written in hands that had been steady too long to shake now. Sensed that every face here wore its own sentence, commuted by exile but not erased. The firelight traced those sentences along cheek and brow, down the line of a nose, across a mouth that had learned how to close after speaking the least required. The night thickened, gentle but heavy with unsaid things. Smoke made a canopy low as a thought. Wind stirred the tattered banner to a whisper and left it. Sake warmed palms and then withdrew. Armor made its small, resigned music. The shamisen lay quiet against its owner's knee, and even quiet, it held the shape of a song. "Sleep," the leader said to no one in particular. Men obeyed by degrees, not because a command had fathered the act, but because the hour had. Cloaks were drawn, swords turned so the mouth of the scabbard faced the body, cups were inverted over their own shadows. Nobu's head lowered by its own weight. In a breath, he had the easy stillness of a boy who knows someone else will wake first and keep watch. Takeshi watched the last piece of wood choose flame or coal, and smiled without moving his mouth when it chose coal. He let the camp's hush grow until it became part of his breath. The banner did not stir. The sky above the pines admitted a single late star and then another. Around the fire, men dreamed the next mile, which looks like the last mile when seen from far enough away. He did not close his eyes yet. He counted his breaths to the measure of the wind in the branches and kept a place inside him for the weight of all that remained unspoken. In that steady keeping, the night drew itself closer, and the clearing, with its misfit armor and its careful knots, became a shelter for strangers who had, in losing their names, found a way to share a little warmth. The fire went on with its work. The wind forgot them for an hour, and the tailies that had almost been told sat around the circle like men waiting their turn and deciding, for once, to let the silence win. Dawn arrived as a breath held between winter and whatever comes after, pale mist settling in the hollows, frost making lace out of the edges of leaves. The ronin camp unstitched itself in silence bedrolls shaken once, embers persuaded into a last useful red, straps pulled to the next hole with the patience of men who knew what one extra notch could save. The banner stirred, remembered it had no crest, and went still again. Takeshi and Nobu bowed to the leader with a small tilt of bodies that said enough. They entered the trees while the shamisen player tested a single string, found a note that agreed with the weather, and let it go. The road was narrow, bordered by brush that had learned to keep low in the wind. Ash had thinned to a dusting on the ditch banks. The air smelled of last night's coals and river stone. Crows followed at a distance with the idle intent of creatures whose business is to know what outlasts men. From time to time, one flew ahead, sat on a bare branch, and waited as if to confirm that footsteps were still willing to be counted. The settlement revealed itself boulder by boulder, sound by sound. First came the faint ringing of a shrine bell. Not bright, not insistent, 2 soft strokes, a pause, a third, as if the bell were telling itself the time and agreeing to keep it. Then a roof line appeared above willow stems, beams dark and slick with the season, crows perched along them in a row like ink dots drying on paper. Smell arrived last, oil rubbed into iron, iron breathing into damp wood giving back a little sweetness from rot and old rain. A shape of a stall coalesced out of the mist, a frame of poles and ropes and roof cloth patched with care, edges weighted by smooth river stones tied with twine. Beneath the roof, the world was made of edges and the stories they kept. Racks held, swords in patient order, blades glinting dully where the mist had not yet found them, hilts worn smooth by forgotten hands. Armor hung as if dozing, plates arranged on crossbars, laces rethreaded into neat patterns that admitted how many ties had been broken. A low table displayed fittings, tsuba cut with absent cranes and waves and leaves. Manuki shaped like gourds or grasshoppers or horses too small to ride, the gold worn to the color of barley by thumb and time. In a shallow tray lay trinkets unclaimed. By memory Nutski carved into fox and turtle and mask, cords stiff with old salt. The stall had the tidiness of someone who had made peace with disorder by sorting it. In the boxes and naming the boxes quietly, the merchant sat behind the table on a square cushion that looked like it had outlived 2 better ones. He was an older man with hair gathered back thinly and eyebrows that had decided to go their own way. His eyes were sharp, but their sharpness was not a blade's. It was more like winter sun finding a clean patch of ice and making it honest. He wore a robe patched in places that did not claim to be anything other than what they were. When he spoke, his voice was a low-reed song under snow, made to travel a short distance and arrive intact. Morning, he said, turning a cloth over his palm until it made a small square and then setting it down again. Mist hides rust. Oyo remembers. Takeshi bowed, not to a lord or to a shrine, but to a man in a doorway enough to say he saw him. Nobu followed a breath later, eyes relieved of their brightness, and set to a respectful gray. They stood within the shelter's edge, wetting their breath learn the new air of oil and iron and damp wood. The shrine bell behind the grove touched itself twice and went still, as if to confirm that silence could be trusted to use the hour wisely. Travelers, the merchant said, pouring a little sake over a rag and wiping the mouth of a scabbard with a motion that suggested he had done it often enough to know when to stop. The road wears its people thin. Swords, too. We look, Takeshi answered. Looking is a kind of buying that pays in a slower coin, the man said, and smiled the kind of smile that adds no shine to the face. Walk the aisles. Do not force names onto things that are tired of them. Nobu stepped past a rack, careful to keep his sleeve from touching any blade. Each sword seemed to hold a temperature of its own, some cool as river stones, some warm as a hand, some nether, the kind that wait to decide. One had a nick in the back edge that had been ground out and left a faint crescent like a moon behind leafless branches. Another bore along its spine the slightest discoloration, the trace of heat that had once loved it too much. A third carried tiny chips near the tip, no bigger than a grain of rice, a record of work done against something that had refused at first to learn the lesson taught by steel. On the next rack hung 2 naginata heads, their poles missing, their sockets packed with cedar shavings to keep rust from crawling in. A kabuto sat on a low shelf, crest torn off and replaced with a strip of leather, the bowl dented in a shape that a hand had failed to correct. Every object here seemed to hold its own breath, as if waiting to see if the world still wanted it. Merchant watched without counting. He dipped a brush into oil, licked his finger to find a grain of dust, and removed it with the compassion a gardener gives to a leaf that has collected what it did not intend. Steel, he said to no one, in particular, is patient until it is not. People are the other way. Takeshi let his gaze travel. He did not fix it on any blade, did not try to read their Hammond like a monk reading weather. He accepted that in this place the stories were not to be summoned like servants. He paused at a suba carved with waves that, in a certain light, could be red as grass, depending on whether a man had slept beside water or a field more often. He touched nothing. He only remembered how much can be carried by a small circle of iron. My stock comes from roads, the merchant said, eyes on his work, and from rooms that have changed their minds. Families send me what they can no longer talk to. Fields give up what they could not keep down when the plow came back. Men who owe me bring what they do not want. Men I owe bring what I ask. The balance finds itself. He set the brush aside. I am a fence for ghosts. Nobu looked at Takeshi and then away, as if he had overheard something that granted him an adult's privilege he should not use too carelessly. He returned his attention to a row of short blades, each wrapped differently. One bore a cord of dull green, half unraveled and retied where it had softened. Another had a knot so precise it might have been made by a scribe copying a sacred line. A third was bound in plain brown, a wrap so evenly worn that it had learned its owner's palm and would never let it go except by death or goodwill. Some things will not be handled, the merchant said quietly, not warning, simply stating. They do not know you yet. Others will pretend to know you too quickly. Those are the dangerous ones. He gestured to Itachi with an overly rich scabbard. That one asked to be admired. It lies. Takeshi allowed a half-breath of amusement to move his mouth and then let it go. He stepped to the end of the stall where trinkets lay arranged in lines like lines of text. In one shallow tray, a collection of ties and rings and small weights waited, a sleeve weight of carved stone, smooth as river language. A ring for a sash with tiny teeth worn flat by years of sliding silk. A charm cut in amber, a fox asleep in itself. In another tray were amulets rubbed thin by a thumma, bodhisattva that looked as weary of protection as those it protected. A coin with a square hole polished into a promise. A lacquered tag on which a name had been scraped off and replaced with nothing. He could have spent an hour here without moving, inventorying the ways men try to persuade fortune and convince time to look elsewhere. The crows shifted on the beams without sound but rearranged themselves the way watchers do when the mid-morning chill thickens. The shrine bell offered one note, testing itself against the mist, then consented to silence. A farmer passed the edge of the stall without looking up, carrying a bundle of brush strapped with rope that had been used so often it had learned the shape of his shoulder. The road contained these motions without comment, as it contains all continuations. Nobu, after some hesitation, pointed with his eyes. This, he said, barely above breath. It was a simple blade, no larger than his forearm, scabbard unadorned, but the guard carried two small grooves along the rim, opposite each other, as if someone had set their fingers there so often the iron had learned to give. The merchant nodded without turning, held by a quiet man, he said, who used it when he must. He asked me to keep it until a son came who would not be proud of it. No son came. The man died. The son did not know the way. The blade has been waiting at my stall since the winter when the river froze early and the eels ran under ice on secret errands. Nobu withdrew his hand. I see. You do? The merchant said, and minute Takeshi looked up. At the far back of the stall, where the mist stayed longer and the boards smelled most openly of wet wood, a rack stood with 3 swords lying on it, each wrapped. 2 were bound in pale cloth that had taken on the color of smoke. The third was wrapped in dark indigo, tied with a tidy knot whose ends had been rubbed until they had rounded like well-worn pebbles. The cloth's weave caught the dim light and gave it back as a muted river. Something about the proportionality of scabbard to hilt, the angle at which it rested, even the quietness of its presence called the eye more than the rack wished to be called. The merchant noticed the direction of seeing the way a man notices wind shift across a pond. He did not speak at once. He wiped the edge of a blade with oil, returned it to its rest, and folded the cloth with the care one gives to something that has agreed to be clean. Then he moved to the rack, slid the indigo bundle onto the table, and placed his hand on it as if greeting a colleague. Some things, he said, carry a road inside them. Takeshi's breath found a narrower place. He did not reach. He allowed the cloth to be cloth, and the possibility within it to continue being possibility. The merchant did not hurry. He untied the knot, each motion measured to respect whatever memory had taught the knot to stay. The indigo opened in a soft sigh. He laid the cloth aside. Within lay a blade with a scabbard on which lacquer had been, built in thin layers, each layer a labor meant to disappear. The lacquer had cracked in one place near the throat at a curve like a thumbprint. The crack had been mended long ago. The hilt wrap was the color of old tea, the diamonds of silk evenly darkened where fingers had traveled. The guard was simple, iron, round, its edge unadorned except for a notched nick the size of a lentil, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. Nobu inhaled, and the sound was so slight it could have been wind and bamboo. Takeshi did not move. The notch lived in him as surely as the nick in Kazuo's emblem lived in his hand. It was not proof. It was not a trick. It was a shape that the body knew before the mind developed a name for it. Came to me after a thaw, the merchant said, voice lower now, as if to keep the crows from learning the story. A woodcutter found it under a bank where ice had decided to shift its allegiance. He brought it wrapped in willow bark, paid for the oil with the bark itself. I asked no question that would teach him to answer poorly. It lacked a name. I gave it shelter. He lifted the blade, did not draw it, rested it across his palms like a sleeping child entrusted for a moment to another's care. Some owners come twice, he said. Once to carry, once to watch. He returned it to the cloth and arranged the cloth to cover it halfway, as if the blade were undecided about whether. Takeshi's throat had become a place where air declined to pass without toll. He swallowed and counted 3 slow breaths the way a man counts the distance to a hill. Price? He asked because a question that could be answered with a number might save him from questions that could not. Not silver. The merchant said gently, not rice, a different coin. He set his hand flat on the cloth. Certainty, he said. This blade asks for certainty. It prefers to be carried by those to whom the road has already spoken. If you are uncertain, he looked up, and his eyes were winter sun sharp without cruelty. You should leave it to me. Nobu's eyes sought Takeshi's profile and then retreated, the way a young man's eyes learn to respect a private room. The shrine bell in the distance gave one careful note, then a second, then accepted that the day would keep itself. The crows along the beam shuffled. One lifted its wings and settled them again without taking flight. I do not sell hauntings, the merchant said, half in humor. I shelter them. When they decide to move, they tell me where to send the bill. Takeshi nodded, the gesture almost invisible. He touched the indigo cloth with 2 fingers, not the blade beneath, and withdrew his hand. The cloth was cool, retaining the stall's mist, retaining nothing of his warmth when he took it away. There are debts, he said, that should not be paid with steel. Spoken like someone who still believes in other currencies, the merchant replied, keep that belief. It has a shorter life than a blade. Nobu, quiet, took a step back. On a higher shelf, his eye had found a small bundle of sashes, each folded, each smelling faintly of camphor. He lifted one and stopped when the merchant's eyebrow tilted. Leave them, the man said, not unkind. Cloth remembers better than men. It gets confused when hands speak the wrong name. Takeshi looked once more at the indigo and at the nick in the guard that almost was and almost was not the one he knew. The distance between proof and recognition could swallow a man as easily as a river under ice. He allowed that river to keep its flow. We thank you, he said. The merchant dipped his head by a quarter finger. I prefer customers who can thank and leave, he said. They live longer. He rewrapped the blade with the same care, not tightening softly as if the cloth itself had agreed to hold. He placed it back on the rack where the boards were darkest, where mist and stall light could come to an understanding about what to show. Then he turned to Nobu and held up a simple maintenance kit, a small bottle of oil, a piece of paper for powder, a strip of silk, a brush cut down to a child's patience. Take this, he said. Pay when you can. Oil now prevents grief later. Nobu bowed twice as if unable to find a single gesture that fit, then settled on once, deep and plain. I will repay, he murmured. Do not, the merchant said. Repay the blade it. Will serve. The road outside the stall made itself ready to be used. A cart creaked past. In it, logs cut square, ends a paler circle within gray, knots like eyes closed in thought. The driver's cough was short and contained. The crows, seeing there was no miracle to announce, hopped 2 steps and stayed, mist then to a color without a name. The shrine bell quieted as if persuaded. Takeshi adjusted his cloak, tied the knot at his sleeve to keep wind from learning his skin. The merchant had gone back to his brush and oil, dabbing, wiping, setting aside, his motions a prayer that did not show its shrine. If the road returns you here, he said without looking up, we will see what chooses. If it does not, be kind to your sandals. They suffer and never complain. Nobu smiled despite the weight in the air. Yes, they bowed and stepped into the morning. The world outside the stall felt wider by an inch enough to make breath find easier passage. Crows watched them go with the indifference of accountants. The mist withdrew with the manners of a host who knows when to leave guests to themselves. The shrine bell, having told its thought to the hour, refused to repeat itself. At the edge of the settlement, Nobu touched the maintenance kit as if it might try to climb away. He walked 2 steps in silence, then 3, and then the question rose the way mist rises when sun takes an interest. That blade, he said, careful. Was it? Takeshi did not answer. He looked up the road where frost had made a brief. Map on the packed earth and wind had erased part of it as a warning against certainty. He carried the image of the indigo cloth, the way one carries a weight under a robe unseen. Unshared, altering the step by a fraction no one else would count. The bell was behind them now, the crows above them, the road in front of them. He let the question enter him and find a seat without a name. They walked. The smell of oil and iron drifted out of their clothes and into the air until the air forgot. The maintenance kit knocked lightly against Nobu's bundle in the rhythm of a small promise. Along a fence, frost brightened and faded, as wind found it and released it. Somewhere ahead, the province continued to be itself ruins returning to field mending itself into food making men remember what a blade must never be asked to solve. Takeshi kept silence, and within it the indigo grew lighter and heavier by turns, like a shadow that sometimes carries a man and sometimes asks to be carried. Evening came without insisting on color. The ridge unrolled its last thin stripe of light and then let the pines take custody of the hour. Takeshi and Nobu found a hollow where needles had built a floor over many winters, the ground quiet and forgiving beneath the weight of 2 men and a day's road. Between roots that rose like the backs of sleeping deer, they set a small fire, no larger than a bowl, its breath a patient thread of orange that asked to be fed slowly. The smoke followed the trunk for a hand's breadth and then wandered into the branches where wind taught it how to be less certain. They ate little a corner of rice cake warmed on the tip of a stick, a mouthful of water that had watched the morning in a bucket and remembered it. Nobu wrapped the maintenance kit tighter and set it beneath his head as if guarding a thought. He slept quickly, the way the young do at the end of honest labor, his breath finding the cadence of needles shivering at the edge of the fire's reach. Takeshi added a thin twig and listened to the small crackle as it gave up what summer had taught it to keep. The night arranged itself into layers, close dark where flame could not persuade, farther dark where trunks stood like ink strokes made. When the hand does not tremble, farthest dark where sky loosened and admitted its first small light. Somewhere beyond the slope, a flute answered itself in fragments, a line of notes left on the wind as if each had been hung there by a careful hand to dry. The melody did not travel far. It offered only the idea of music, then folded back into silence without complaint. In the pause, the faintest fragrance carried clean and bittersweet, the shadow of incense though none burned, the kind of scent that must have walked long to reach them and now asked only to rest. Shadows moved as shadows will when there is more than one light in a man. The fires and memories. The smoke turned its pages slowly. Takeshi let his eyes go half closed and the world's edges soften their insistence. The indigo cloth he had not taken from the merchant's rack returned to sit where thoughts can sit without names. He did not invite it, and it did not leave. He watched the fire narrow itself to a thin, bright seam at the heart, then widen again. The seam made a gate. Beyond it lay a corridor made of breath. Sayori did not arrive. The hour learned how to speak her. Branches received less of the wind, and then more of it. The small bell of resin inside the fire popped once, a sound so light it might have been a moth discovering glass. He felt the skin of the night draw nearer, not to trap, but to consult, and in that narrowing, he knew the old presence the way a man knows. The feel of a room where he has once set his sandals in. Order. A shape took place in the firelight where shape need not have been. Not a body, not an absence. A dark more articulate than the other darks, as if flame had remembered someone and was trying to copy her with its small vocabulary. The needles at his shoulder leaned as if to hear better. His breath entered the shape and returned to him altered, cooler and more careful. When Sayori spoke, her voice was not in the air. It was in the distance between flame and bark, in the brief silence after a twig gives way, in the room between a flute note and the next decision. It was the voice pines. Keep for consenting to snow. The road keeps your name, she said. Takeshi did not lift his head. It keeps many, he answered, very low. Yours walks ahead of your feet. A long, soft flicker went through the hollow, as if something had pulled the fire's breath and let it go. Nobu turned once in sleep and settled, oblivious, his palm finding the edge of his mat as if to confirm that ground continued. The hand that warms itself, Sayori's not voice continued, has learned a new sleeve. He saw, without seeing, Dago's sleeve and the small brown ring on the metal strap end, the wing that was and was not a crane, the oiled card with its 2 strokes crossed where a seal would sit if a seal had been wanted. He tasted ash in the old way and said nothing. The burning crane is not a bird, she said, but a hand held steady over paper. A distant gust combed the pines. Their tops answered in a hush like cloth speaking to cloth. The fire leaned and corrected itself. A thread of incense there could be none knit the moment to other hours, the shrine bell, the folded paper, the ash smoothed with a small wooden rake before morning eyes could read it for meaning. He let the thread rest across his chest. "Your brother left you a door?" Sayori murmured. "You have studied it long enough to know it's wood." He let one breath go deeper, into the place behind the ribs where winter had made room. "I will not paint it with grief," he whispered. "No," she agreed, as if this were a matter already decided between them. "Paint is for festival. This door opens to work." The flute returned from the slope with fewer notes, as if the player had chosen to listen for someone else's tune. The fire trimmed itself. A beetle, awakened too early in the season, lifted and settled with a clicking that sounded like two stones meeting politely. Takeshi watched his own hand, not quite his own now, extend toward the heat. It did not seek warmth. It sought the boundary, where skin understands fire's geometry and does not cross it. Silence. Sayori said, and the word moved through the needles and back again, is heavier than steel when it carries a house. He thought of the Hall of Pine, of Kensei's mouth and the set of it, of the emblem left between the strap end and the oiled card, of the guard's steps taken in obedience to a structure that keeps children from worrying and sometimes forgets. The names that built it. He tasted that structure again, dry and exact, and felt the place in him where obedience and refusal are neighbors nod without shaking hands. "Speak to save breath," she said, the old line made new by the way she placed it. "Until then, listen." "I will," he said. "Do not sharpen anger," she added. "It eats the stone as well as the blade." The embers rose and fell in inclination. Above them, the constellations were lifting out of their boxes, each star a pin pushed carefully. Into winter's board. Somewhere behind sleep, Nobu's mouth formed a word and then chose not to say it. The boy turned toward the warm side of himself and gave it back. Sayori's presence darkened and lightened, like a thought that will not settle for long on either of the two available shelves. "The merchant showed you a river wrapped in indigo," she said. He allowed the cloth to unfold once more in his mind, and with it the quiet, precise notch on the guard, a mark almost too modest for the way memory can shout. The fire set a small white tooth at the edge of a coal and then hid it again. "Not every likeness is a return," she continued. "Some are only a courtesy the road pays to the tired." He wanted to ask, was it his brother's? But the question felt like a tool that would bruise what it tried to lift. He swallowed it and let the hunger turn into another kind of attention. "You will walk," she said, "where men have poured their fear into wheat and called it policy." A wind came, made of the same cold that reminds a man how carefully he must keep his hands. The fire accepted the instruction. Sparks rose and did not travel. They died in the air like moths discovering winter. Somewhere farther down the ridge, the flute closed its case invisibly. The night continued to know itself. "Storms gather," Sayori said, "not from heaven, but from men." He thought of the line that eats, then sleeps, then eats, of villages ash gray, of a merchant who built his stall to listen to iron, of ronin whose silence could be poured into a mold and cast as patience. He thought of a crest cut away from a banner, of a clerk's hand that would later record what the storm had done and how much it had cost to do it. The thought was not anger. It was the weight of a bucket drawn slow from a deep well. "Where?" he asked, and the question had no map attached to it. "Between the two breaths after an order," she said. "In the space where a seal sits before it cools." A subtle, oddly sweet fragrance. Could it be sap, resin? Memory passed through the hollow and was gone. He remembered the ash field on the memorial tray, raked into shallow waves, and the small furrow where a stick had been lifted before it spin itself. He remembered the way Dago's regard had made the air narrower and how it had not narrowed his resolve. Nobu breathed deeper and let the night take half his weight. You cannot restore honor with a transaction, Sayori said. You can only place it in the right room and keep the door shut. I will carry, he said. Carry quietly, she returned. The shadow of the fire cast deepened and then lost. Detail, as if her outline had decided weight was not its business. The needles above had stopped speaking. The boughs had learned the afterthought a wind leaves when it chooses other pines to manage. The earth's cold worked patiently at his knees and was patient enough not to insist. Listen for the flute in places where flutes should not be, she said. Also for the absence of bells where bells should speak. He nodded once, a movement that felt like laying a small stone on a cairn. The night took it and kept it. The crane will burn on paper, she said, and the line had no softening. This time, hands will warm. Words will claim weather as accomplice. Walk between the lie and the cold air. Let the air do the work. He breathed deliberately, taking in the taste of bark and smoke, and touched the red knot below the guard of his short blade. Fred remembered him and wanted nothing. You are not required to win, Sayori said, as if instructing a child in a kindness adults often forget. You are required to carry the right weight. The boy, he said, unbidden. Give him rooms, she answered, not walls. Fire lowered itself to a heartbeat. The smallest coal held a house of light. Within and did not brag about it. Between one pulse and the next, Sayori's knot voice came from the far side of the hollow, then from the pine overhead, then from the space between his own hands, as if she had placed something there without moving anything. You will walk, she said, and now it was that future perfect tone the night loves when it is sure of morning, where silence is heavier than steel. He closed his fingers around nothing to learn its shape. The nothing had edges. Do not be surprised, she added gently, when men mistake your silence for consent. Let them. Consent is not quiet. It has a different smell. What of Kensei? He asked, the name itself, a leaf fallen flat on water. He will hear what he cannot admit, she said. When the ledger refuses an entry, the debt does not die. It waits at the door and learns the house is ours. And Dago? A pause. A tiny pine seed dropped and landed near his knee like a punctuation mark that had been looking for the right sentence. Names are paper, Sayori said. Actions are weather, you know which tears roofs. He allowed a turn of breath that almost became a laugh, but arrived as gratitude instead. The flute, far away again, tried a single note and left it to crystallize. The needles shifted with the smallest glissando of resin, rest, Sayori said, and the word itself arranged the hollow. You will be asked to stand longer than you like. He wanted to ask for one proof that the indigo blade beyond his reach had not been a trick of winter, a courtesy of fatigue, a reflection in a merchant's eye. He did not. He would not ask the night to turn memory into a receipt. The storm gathers, she repeated, not from heaven, but from men. A whisper of warmth lifted from the ashes and touched the knuckles of his right hand. Choose the work. The work will choose you back, the shape unshaped. The fire's seam widened, and then was merely fire again. The faint fragrance that had made the hollow resemble a shrine surrendered its permission and left. The flute drew itself into a coat and went away. Above, stars had sharpened. The cold had taken their measure and made them truthful. Nobu sighed and turned toward the ember's glow. The boy's face briefly red, and then not red dot Takeshi stayed a little longer in the open doorway between waking and sleep. He'd counted 5 breaths to see if a hand would return to block it. None did. The pines resumed their quiet and let snow that was not falling be imagined. He reached for a twig, decided against it, and let the fire work at what remained of the day. The small bowl of light polished the air up to his wrists and left the rest to the care of cold. He lay back on needles that gave under shoulder. and hip with the exact courtesy the hour required. He closed his eyes and saw the movement of Soaries. Shadow within the smoke, as one sees a fish under clear ice there, and not personal and not quick and not in a hurry. He did not chase the image. He let it continue its own river dot. By the time sleep arrived, honestly, the coals had slipped into a deeper red, and the crust around them had turned to a dim ring like a moonstone under fingertip. The hollow had emptied itself of scent. Only bark and winter and the honest earth remained. Nobu slept unaware, one hand on the maintenance kit as if it were a small creature that must be kept warm. The night, relieved of its work as messenger, returned to its work as guardian. Cold stars kept their stations with a discipline the day would respect, and the last whisper of the pines said nothing a man could repeat, which is the kind of counsel that lasts. Morning balanced itself on the shoulders of the mountains and did not hurry to fall. The pass ahead gathered the day into a narrow brightness, a corridor of rock where frost still lived in shadow and needles kept last night's cold. Takeshi and Nobu walked with the light at their backs, their breaths neat and spare, sandals making a dry hush on the path's packed dust. Here and there small fans of gravel spilled from the slope, fresh, delicate, as if the mountain had shaken itself in the dark and offered the road a handful of crumbs. The air smelled of stone, made damp by old snow and of pine sap sealed into winter. Somewhere behind and above, a crow rehearsed 2 notes and then withheld the third, as if saving it for a better hour. Wind passed so carefully that it seemed to be reading the path, learning where sound could travel without disturbing anything that preferred to be left alone. In such a place, a footfall becomes important, and the body learns not to waste it. They moved with Soari's words, still warm in the places where such words rest, storms gathering from men, silence heavier than steel. Takeshi did not startle. When a pebble slipped under his heel, the sound zipped out, hit the far wall, and returned softer, like a child coming back to a room already quiet. Nobu followed 1 pace behind and a little left, the habit grown automatic now. His eyes traced the seams of shadow where rock leaned over rock, and the color changed by a patient finger's width. The pass constricted to a shoulder's breadth, and then, beyond a bend, opened to a shelf of light. A birch had found a way to root there and held its white trunk like a brush lifted from ink. Under it, the path widened enough that a cart might pause and consider turning. Takeshi slowed and put 2 fingers to the air without looking back. Nobu stopped. Nothing moved but a thread of dust hanging where their feet had stirred it. The crow gave its withheld note, and then, as if ashamed, flew wings laboring briefly, black against bright. The sound of feathers beating escaped upward, then thinned. A stone struck another stone above them. Not a slide, not a settled, rich human weight measuring itself wrong, and then correcting. The smoke came next, faint but sure, sweat-warmed. Inside a coat that has been worn too long, the sour iron of rusted fittings rubbed with oil too cheap to hide it, a leather strap salted by use. Nobu's mouth opened and closed. A breath went in and did not rush to leave. Takeshi stepped forward into the shelf's light and to the right, giving the drop his empty side. He kept his hands where they always are, one near the knot below the guard, one easy along the seam of the robe. Gravel made it small, betraying music to the left 2 paces upslope, then held. Another weight waited in the cleft ahead, where a shadow had learned to imitate a man. A third behind, tasting the moment as if it were a piece of fruit, almost not worth the effort. Desperation has a smell, too. It carries the faint heat of hunger, and the cold of a plan that knows its own thinness. Low, Takeshi said. Without turning, Nobu bent his knees and found the earth without losing height. The boy's hand went to the hilt and rested there, not gripping, not announcing. His breath sank. He watched a patch of shadow near the birch and saw, for the first time, the slow, careful shift of a blade catching a thumb's worth of light. Sun, filtered through needles and stone, struck and slid quicksilver, then gone. They came with the sound of gravel crushed under sudden feet, a harsh intake of breath pulled through cloth, a brief scrape of metal dragged from a scabbard that had forgotten how to be generous. A shout in rough syllables, not to frighten, but to tell each other it had begun. The first man dropped from the cleft, a short blade in his hand, wrist turned for a low cut meant to take a leg by surprise. Takeshi's. The step was not faster than the cut, it was earlier. He was not there when the blade arrived. The short sword left his scabbard with a sound too small to be an answer, and iron found iron as if the pass itself had asked for quiet. The meeting rang once, cautious. The cliff swallowed the echo almost before it could learn that it was a sound. Another figure arose from behind the birch, face smudged with soot, eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with courage. He carried a spear with a head too light for the shaft, bound on with cord scavenged from a fishing net. Nobu saw the net's old knots, and in that small noticing found himself calmer, as if the spear's absurdity had turned it into something he could negotiate with. The man's ankles showed above his sandals. Where the skin had been left to winter, it was gray and cracked. He breathed through his mouth, and his teeth were the color of tea. Back, Nobu said, to himself and to the spear both. The man thrust. Nobu did not parry heavily. He let the head slide past his sleeve and felt its breath on his arm, then caught the shaft with a turn of his wrist and pushed it down as if placing a broom back on a hook. The wood resisted, then obeyed. The spear went low. The man's shoulder went higher to compensate. Balance made its complaint. Nobu stepped in and touched the man's forearm with the tsuba of his blade, light, a suggestion rather than an order. The man stumbled. Gravel agreed, then betrayed him. He dropped the spear to catch himself and found only air. Nobu did not raise his sword. He stood, weight sunk, and waited for the next thing that would need to be answered. To Takeshi's right. A knife flashed improvised steel ground to a willful edge. The arm that carried it trembled, not with fear, but with exhaustion. The knife's carrier had wrapped his wrist with a length of red cloth to make it braver. He came in close, the way hunger comes in when it decides to be work for a day. Takeshi offered him sleeve and then took it away, and the man cut emptiness so cleanly the emptiness felt taut. A second knife appeared from the man's other hand, two small suns burning briefly in filtered light. Takeshi stepped once, almost idle, and the knives met each other in front of their owner, a dull kiss that confused them. He placed his palm against the man's chest and borrowed enough of his weight to set him down where the mountain would be willing to keep him a moment. No blood yet, only the light coming and going as Cloud learned the angle of stone. Behind them, a figure tried to climb into the shelf from below, fingers searching for holds, boots making little squeaks where wet had soaked leather and wrought iron into a complaint. Nobu heard the squeak and turned his head, but not his shoulders. He moved his right foot the length of a thumb and his left hand the width of a breath. He did not chase the man. He let the man finish climbing and watched his face arrive in the world the rest of him had already asked for. When it did, right, and startled and full of the kind of hope that prefers to be fear, Nobu lowered his blade and placed it in the space that lay between hope and fear. The man saw it too late to mistake it. He slid back and landed on his knees, not because anyone had demanded so much, but because the mountain refuses certain negotiations. Leave it, Takeshi said, his voice the temperature of slate. Leave it, the man repeated to himself, and obeyed. Wind rose and arranged itself along the pass, bringing smells forward into the light sweat that had washed itself away and returned. Rusted steel persuaded to behave by oil that had lost its argument. The tart shadow of old fires damped by yesterday's snow. A crow, startled from a wreck, launched itself so suddenly that its wings struck a branch with a dry sound, then found room and climbed. The bandit's feet, sandaled and wrapped, skidded and bit the gravel and small. Furious syllables. One came from the left wall with a cudgel whittled down from a branch. Knots left proud as if they had the right to be purposeful. He swung wide, discovering in the middle of the arc that the past preferred modest gestures. The cudgel struck rock and made a sound like a bucket kicking at a well's mouth. Nobu winced with his ears and stepped aside, letting the man's own strength move past him into the empty light. He brought his short blade up with an economy that surprised even the blade, then stopped it an inch short of the man's throat. The man's eyes found the inch and grew large within it. He took 2 breathless steps back and held up an empty hand without knowing why the gesture came with that hand and not the other. Takeshi and the first attacker had begun to breathe in the same measure now. The man's knife hand shook once, then steadied. His face had the worn, chapped look of someone who sleeps too near a fire and too far from shelter. He lunged, not a soldier's lunge, not an assassin's, only a man deciding not to be hungry. If it could be avoided. Takeshi took his wrist with 2 fingers and turned the blade so that it read the path's dust instead of the path's blood. The knife touched ground and stung itself. The man made a sound that was half swear and half sorrow. The cliffs pity the second half of such sounds and leave the first for the wind to forget. Go, Takeshi said. The man obeyed the tone and not the word, which is often how sense works. He backed into shadow and became part of it again, leaving behind the smell of a man who meant to live longer if allowed. From above and ahead, the leader showed himself at last. Not a crest maker, not a planner, only the one with the most voice left. He wore a short cuirass warped by a summer he had not controlled, laces replaced with cord taken from a fisherman's. Broken trap. His face had the stubbornness of rocks that think they are walls. He came down the slope sideways, knees bent, the mountain disagreeing with the angle of his blade and telling him so with every step. He shouted one word, thick with road dust. Leave. Or perhaps it was give. It did not matter. The word was the shape of hunger trying to sound like policy. Nobu felt the shout in his ribs and was surprised that his hands did not jump. They stayed where training had taught them to wait. One open, one with a handle lightly pinned. He saw the leader's gaze slide over him to Takeshi and knew he was, for a moment, safe in someone else's underestimation. The knowledge felt cold and useful. The leader reached the shelf and did not give himself time to study it. He stepped at Takeshi with a cut that would have been low if it had not been born from a knee scalded too long by weather. Takeshi shifted weight from one foot to the other, an adjustment more appreciated by sand than by steel. The blade passed where his hip had expected to be. The leader recovered with a speed that told more of age than of skill. Takeshi answered with the least of motions, the kind that corrects rather than punishes, and the 2 of them found a brief plain on which to meet. Steel spoke, terse, and the cliffs refused to brag about carrying its voice. Breathe, Takeshi told the air. Nobu heard and obeyed. The leader drew back, surprised to find himself still holding a sword. He set his feet wider, as if hoping ground could correct a life. He came again, impatience adding a finger's breadth to the length of his cut. Takeshi let the blade find his own and gave it a smaller surface than it had expected. It skated, lost confidence, and went to the place where men learn what gravity is named. The leader stumbled. He did not fall. He gathered himself and blinked in a way that made it clear he had not expected the morning to need this much concentration. Then the pass offered one more figure, late and out of breath from the notch behind Nobu. a boy younger than Nobu by a winter with a farmer's cap, a blade too long for his arm, fear and want tugging at him in different directions. His shoes were wrong for the slope. He slipped, skidded, and almost found his knees. He chose pride instead and swung with both hands as if cutting a stubborn rice stalk. The swing's honesty almost gave it strength. Nobu met it without anger, and because the boy deserved such respect, without contempt. He lowered his shoulder, raised his forearm, and let steel ring on wood and leather, a dull bright sound that bounced once and rested in the rock. The boy's eyes flew to the echo, as if it might help. It did not. Go home, Nobu said, and the words were older than his throat. The boy's jaw lifted, a reflex. His blade came again, clumsy, brave, the kind of stroke a teacher would have corrected with a stick and patience. Nobu stepped inside. It felt on his cheek the warm breath of someone who had not slept, and placed the guard of his blade against the boy's wrist. He pressed down and forward, a simple motion with no future in it. The boy's fingers, instructed by surprise, let go. The blade fell, slapped the path, and lay there with the offended dignity of an object unused to such treatment. The boy looked at it as if it were a brother he had disappointed. Then he looked at Nobu. Go, Nobu said again, and this time the word borrowed some of the pass's authority. The boy went, backing the way men do when they hope dignity can be worn like a cloak across a hole in a coat. The leader saw it all and did not gather philosophy from it. He tried one last time to cut a space for himself. Takeshi's blade met his with a soft, decisive sound, the way a door meets a latch when both have been made by a patient hand. He turned the leader's wrist, not fiercely, not gently, precisely, and the sword lifted in a brief, baffled arc, then dropped to the shelf with a slap of iron on grit. The leader reached for it and found Nobu's short blade touching the air above his knuckles. No, Nobu said. The word had a tremor in it, a small bell halfway struck. But it held. The leader's breath broke and then returned. He looked at the boy who had fled and decided that this was not the day to fetch anyone back. He stepped away from the blade the way a man steps away from a crate of fish that he has not paid for. He raised both hands and showed palms worn thin by a work that did not belong to him. He said nothing. He did not have to. The past had already spoken in his place. Wind climbed the wall and cooled the sweat it found there. The smell of rust moved aside to make room for pine, and the pine did not mind sharing. Crows, once alarmed into flight, settled on a ledge and watched with the measured indifference of creatures who expect men to produce these small storms and then leave them behind. Gravel, disturbed, rolled to rest and made the quiet clicking. Sounds by which cliffs count the minutes, one by one. The bandits realized that the hunger which had driven them into the path was not going to be fed. They were not soldiers enough for retreat to be a shameful word. They took it as if it had been written on the road and passed along casually back into cracks. Around the birch, up a seam of rock where the shadow took in new citizens without asking for papers. The leader gathered dignity as best he could, turned his face to the slope, and went, leaving behind the shape of a man in the air like heat over a cooked field. The cudgel lay where it had chosen to rest. The spear, embarrassed, had slid into. A bush-dot silence returned in parts, as a house is put back in order after visitors who did not stay for tea. The crow on the ledge shook itself, once feathers rasping together in a dry applause, and tucked its head. The echo of steel, which had played for the cliffs as if they were audience enough, died and did not try to have a second life. The past resumed breathing. Takeshi stood with his blade lowered at his side, the point a respectful distance from the dust, as if conversation had ended, and it was not his place to have the last word. He looked to Nobu. The boy had not moved. From the stuck that forbids the fallen blade, His shoulders were set correctly. His feet, for once, had arrived exactly where training and luck agreed to meet Dot by his sandals lay. A man who had come in too close with his hunger and found a simple correction waiting for him, not a finishing, only a lesson. Further back, near the notch, the youngest attacker had left a blade that now looked like a tool abandoned in a field the morning a storm came. Nobu's chest rose and fell in even measures. He blinked and found that the world was still being held up by its posts and beams, Takeshi sheathed, and the mouth of the scabbard made that small finishing sound that has ended so many hours. He gave no praise. He gave no counsel. He let the quiet reach the boy without passing through an adult's words, which tire easily after such work. Nobu bent and retrieved his breath from where he had put it. His hands began to tremble, not with fear. Fear trembles differently, faster, less honest. This tremor was the body acknowledging weight, the weight of choosing not to be someone else's lesson, the weight of being one's own, the weight of the blade's truth and the pass's patience. He stood there, the short sword low, point toward the path, letting his fingers learn what they had done. Breathe, Takeshi said, as he had said before, and the word did not carry advice so much as companionship. Nobu breathed. The wind crossed his face and recognized him. The smell of sweat and rest yielded to the smell of stone and sap. A crow decided with the solemnity of crows that the matter was finished and flew on, drawing a single stroke across the morning. Nobu's eyes followed it for half a wing beat and then dropped to the gravel where pebbles lay in new patterns. A map the mountain would erase when it was ready. They did not hurry to move on. The pass had asked for stillness and been given it. It seemed only polite to return the favor once the asking was done. Takeshi adjusted the tie at his sleeve, tightened it one more notch, and let his palm rest on the knot below the guard. Nobu shook his hands once, as if drying them after a river, and looked at his blade as if seeing, at last, not its shine but its work. They stepped forward together, walking slowly at first so the pass could learn their measure again. Gravel, crunched and small, forgiving syllables. A narrow band of sunlight slid down the wall and took a place beside them, no longer curious. Behind, the shelf held its quiet. Ahead, the path curved toward a stand of cedar that held shadows in the correct proportions. The storm men had brought into the corridor had spent itself like a brief squall that knows it has no business in winter. The air, made clean by its own patience, accepted them as they went. Nobu's hands continued their tremor lighter now, more honest still. He did not hide it. He carried it the way a man carries a lesson, with respect and without display. Takeshi glanced once at him and then away, a glance that a lesser eye might have missed, but that would teach a boy more than praise. He said nothing. Approval given too soon melts like frost in the first light. Left unsaid, it hardens into something a man can step on and not slip. The pass broadened. Wind found its long voice and played a low note that the cliffs approved. Crows wrote short sentences on the sky and then edited them into nothing. The smell of iron drained away into the smell of pine, then into the smell of sun on stone. Their footsteps resumed the rhythm of travelers whose names the road keeps soft, steady, necessary, and the morning closed its ledger on the brief account that had tried to complicate it. The farmhouse had kept its shape out of courtesy, not strength. Beams laid open to the evening like ribs, roof patched by wind with handfuls of straw, doors hanging but no longer deciding whether to be shut or open. Takeshi and Nobu entered at twilight and chose a corner where the floor was more floor than earth. Between cracked posts, a narrow hearth crouched, a rectangle of stones and soot so old it seemed to remember each meal it had warmed. They knelt, gathered splinters from a broken trough and the dry fringe of a mat, and nursed a small fire into being. Flame rose with a quiet acceptance, amber laying itself along ruined walls, shadows drawing out to their fullest height and then settling as if they had found the posture they could hold until dawn. Dust lifted, turned into small stars in the smoke, and returned to the boards at their own pace. The wind found a gap in the south wall and worked it until the gap spoke two tones of wood. One higher, one lower, a seesaw conversation that never resolved. Somewhere in the loft, a beam creaked and then changed its mind. The house smelled of the honest things that stay. Dry straw, old ash, the faint remainder of kitchen smoke that has learned how to live in plaster and grain. On the floor, scrap paper lay like leaves from a winter tree torn corners with a stroke of brush, a pale grid from an account book, the back of a letter with the greeting missing, and the farewell too polite to matter. Someone's day had fallen apart here, but it had fallen apart quietly. They ate little rice softened in the pot with a soldier's patience, a sliver of dried fish, tea boiled to a brown that was more comfort than flavor. Nobu set his bowl down with care and lay on his side at once, cloak pulled to the chin, the day's weight transferring from muscle to mat. His breath steadied quickly, found its length, and began to fold the minutes into packets the night would keep. Takeshi added one stick and then another, watched each darken, skin blister, and pull back. Pale cinder accept heat, flame appear. The light walked across the nearest wall and picked out a brush mark. 2 verticals. Interrupted, not a character, only a practice. Near it, soot had been rubbed with the heel of a hand into a smudge the size of a moon. The house held these traces, without asking to be congratulated for it. Outside, a crow called once and hoarded the rest of its voice. Wind stroked winter grass until it sounded like paper being sorted. The mountains that had made the day narrow now made the night tall. Takeshi sat with his knees under his palms and let the room grow quiet around him, the kind of quiet that has weight. He felt at his wrist the neat bite of the knot he had tied against the cold, and the old pain in his shoulder that came and went as if measuring him for a coat. Scraps of paper lay near the hearth. He drew 3 closer with 2 fingers. One was the corner of a bill of grain. The numbers were small, honest strokes. 2 totals corrected in a different hand and left corrected with a single mark of agreement. Another scrap bore the start of a letter, a respectful greeting to someone's mother, the brush clenching at health and losing at rice, the kind of line a son writes while the kettle finds its song. The third was nothing at all fiber, and pale, a field awaiting ink. He held that blank piece to the firelight and remembered the unwritten. Not for the first time, he allowed the memory to stand at the edge of the room and watch him. There had been a winter when he had meant to write to Kazuo from a fort on a frozen road. The oil in the lamp had burned low. The brush had been cleaned, wrapped in paper, set above the beam to keep bristles obedient. He had thought the sentences and even placed them in order on the night's table as a cook lays dishes before a guest arrives. He had meant to write of the way frost forms a pale thread at a gate latch, then grows into lace if no one touches it. He had meant to ask if the quince had survived the heavy snow that year, and to remind Kazuo of the strap on the saddle that needed a new hole, and to say without saying it that he was more at ease when his brother's silence was in the room, since it taught his own silence how to be useful. He had meant to write, and the bell had sounded, and the road had called, and the letter had remained in his head where no one could read it and no one could burn it. The house creaked again. Ash settled in the grate. Nobu breathed and did not move. The fire flickered a long shape along the broken inner door, as if a man stood there and had decided to be only a shadow for the evening. Takeshi let the thought take him to another letter never written. A summer evening by a river with low water and round stones warm from the day. He had watched boys catch minnows with their hands, and a monk roll his robe to the knee to cross without soaking the hem. He had meant to tell Kazuo that the peaches were late but sweet because of it, and that the river, seen from a bend at the willows, looked like a blade beaten too many times and now content to be blunt. He had meant to confess that he was slower, to anger than he had been, and that the slowness had frightened him at first, and then made him understand. He could look more carefully at a room before entering. He had meant to write of a woman at the ford who did not speak, but pointed to a safe depth, and then went on with her basket. He had meant to ask if the elder hawk still nested near the north gate. The letter had not found paper. He had folded it in his breath and carried it until the air learned its shape and forgot it. Wind touched the gap and set the wall to speaking again. Two tones, back and forth, as if the house argued gently with itself and liked never to win. Takeshi studied the blank scrap and tried again. A letter from the night after a trial that had been called order, to say, "The structure holds, but it does not know me today. I will step outside it until it remembers. Keep the rice measure level for those who cannot lift it. I will carry what I can with my mouth closed." A letter from the grove with the fallen men, to say, "The mark was a wing, and the wing a habit, and the habit a hand warming itself. I think I see, but I will not speak before breath needs saving." A letter from the snow, to say, "I have found your emblem." It was colder than it had a right to be. The nick remained honest. I touched it with my thumb, and it felt like work. These two had remained unnamed, in a place behind the ribs that belongs to small, exact sentences. A beam above him let out a sigh. The sound climbed the wall, like a line of ink spreading where the paper is thirsty. The tea cooled. He drank it anyway, grateful for the taste of a cup held in both hands. The fire settled its shoulders, flame laying into ember, ember showing a larger heart within, the way good men do when the hour gets old. He looked at Nobu, the dark curve of his hair, the hand tucked under the cheek in a posture he might outgrow, and might not. The boy breathed as if the night had set a gentle metronome beside him. In that steadiness, he remembered a different breathing, Kazuo's on a ridge in rain, when they had stood facing opposite directions and seen the same thing, the need to hold ground, the need to move, the way both can live in the same day without destroying it. The scraps of paper whispered when he shifted them, a sound like grass under a light step. On one, the ghost of brush had written a character for weight, thin and faded as if it had been washed and dried on the line of a year's weather. He ran a thumb along the edge and felt the softness where mice had tried it. He set it aside and looked at the blank again. The letter came back, this one from the road that followed Exile, and it said, "Brother, I could list the names of distances, but they would not become days unless you walked them with me. The wind in the past plays one note and then changes its mind, which is a kind of teaching. Crows keep their counsel, which is another. The boy has learned his first correction in iron and has not bragged. I approve and do not say so. You would approve and pretend to scold me." He smiled at nothing. The smile stayed, small and undecorated, until it had done its work. He let his hands rest. The quiet came closer. Outside, needles answered a heavier gust, and then were still. The night let the mountain own it completely. The fire made a low, regular sound like a baker tapping ash from a peel. The house, relieved by warmth, forgot to creak for a time, and in that gap even the dust seemed to settle in better order. Nobu's breath flinched and steadied, a dream crossing a shallow stream and wetting only the hems. Without opening his eyes, the boy asked, "Does it become easier?" Takeshi turned his head one finger's width. "No," he said. "Nobu, single quotes, breath deepened, as if he had expected that. "Then how?" he asked after a long while, not from the mouth, but from the place sleep speaks. "We carry it correctly," Takeshi answered. The answer found a place in the room and stayed. Nobu did not move again. His breathing resumed its companionable measure, the sound as comforting as a familiar gate seen from the road. Takeshi drew his cloak tighter and looked up. The roof had given a panel entirely to sky at some long ago wind. Through it a few stars made order of a black that wanted to break. He thought of Sayori's lines, the storm that gathers from men, silence heavier than steel, and of the merchants. Indigo cloth of a notch like a river bend. He thought of a letter he had almost written in the merchant's stall and had decided to keep as a burden instead. I will not let steel decide for me. Show me if you wish, but do not require. Another memory rose, one older than war, the night before their father's funeral, when they had sat outside the house and the paper lantern had made a small orange moon of itself. Kazuo had said nothing, and had also said everything. Takeshi had meant to write the next day, I will follow your silence until it leads me somewhere I can shake hands with. Forgive me in advance for the mistakes I will make while I am trying to keep faith with a set of rules that feels bigger than my arms. He had not written. They had both walked into years, and the years had chosen their own handwriting. He could still feel that unwritten letter in his pocket sometimes, heavier than a coin, lighter than a stone. He reached for one more scrap and found a piece with holes chewed along one edge. The holes made a rhythm. He imagined filling the page. Kazuo, I meant to write you from the river when the boys were catching minnows with their hands, and the monk lifted his robe to spare the hem. I meant to say the world looked held together by strings I could not see, and the only honest thing to do was not to pull them. Meant to write you from the frozen fort about the sound of rope on a gate, how it sings when the cold makes a voice. Out of fibers, and to confess, I liked that sound more than the noise of victory. I meant to write you after I carried your emblem home from the snow. I would have said I pressed the nick with my thumb as if I could warm it, and felt nothing but the truth refusing to be otherwise. I meant to write you after I walked out of the hall and into the weather they made for me. To say the structure stands and I will stand outside it until it remembers my name. To ask you to meet me in the work instead of the room. I meant to write you tonight, though the ink is gone, and the brush is someone else's, and the paper is what the wind left under the bed. He did not move his lips. He let the sentences pass through him as they would have passed through the brush. The firelight steadied its hand. On the broken wall, the shadow of his shoulder laid itself beside the shadow of a post until they became a single dark. He imagined writing what could not be sent. Do not worry for the boy. He has learned to hold fear where the hand cannot shake it free. He asks small questions that hold large rooms. I have given him a key that is only a to not worry for me. I am not more sad than a winter field is sad. I am quiet. Quiet is not consent. If there is any anger left in me, it is the kind that makes a blade dull quickly. I will keep it in. The scabbard and sharpened patience on the stone that does not wear out. If you stand anywhere near the work we used to share, turn your head a little. I will feel the motion in the wind and carry it. A mouse ticked in the wall, earning a crumb would spin in 6 steps. The tea was gone. He warmed his hands over the coals. He entered the fingers and sat. He looked again at the blank scrap and saw not words, but a fold. He shaped the paper without touching it half, then half again, the way a man makes a note small enough to keep in a sleeve. He laid the invisible page on his palm, closed his fingers as if to keep it from blowing away, and held it over the fire. Then he opened his hand and let nothing fall. Sparks lifted with the grace of small creatures that do not dread their shortness. They rose, curved, dimmed, and forgot to be themselves. Smoke found a beam and traced its length. The beam creaked. Once, quieter now that heat had made it remember. The broken walls took the long shadows and laid them down. The roof gave another square to the stars, or perhaps he had learned to see the gaps he had ignored at dusk. Nobu turned and settled his cheek on the back of his hand. Takeshi watched the rise and fall of breath, the bellows soft and regular. A blacksmith too young to know what fire he might need. He looked back to the coals. The red interior glowed without argument. He felt, as he often did at such hours, the presence of a house he could not enter, but that still welcomed him. Rooms with no walls, rules with no clerk to keep them, a table set for those who carry what cannot be set down. He folded the invisible, let her one last time, and placed it on the hearthstone. Then he slid it forward, saw nothing cross the margin, and watched the coals glow brighter, as if grateful for a story that would never tire the mouth. Ash lifted, turned, settled. The wind sang the seam in the wall again, two tones like breath, learning to speak and deciding not to. He leaned back, drew the cloak higher, and let the night come closer. Out beyond the broken door, the fields lay in their simple winter geometry, furrows sleeping under a pale skin. The pass they had crossed in the morning kept its own counsel beneath the moon. Somewhere a bell in a far settlement tried the hour and chose not to finish it. Crows, black punctuation on a blacker line, tucked their heads and accepted grammar. For the night, Takeshi closed his eyes. The words he had composed and uncomposed drifted into the part of sleep that keeps what should be kept. With fire surrendered flame and turned itself wholly into ember, then into the idea of ember, then into warmth without shape. He breathed with the house with the wind with the field with the mountain, until the chain had no start and required no end. In that chain, letters never sent found their place, unwritten, unburned, carried correctly. The night closed in with quiet acceptance and held them both until morning. The land grew lean as they neared the outer marshes, thinned of trees and conversation, its grasses coarse and gray-green, its stones holding a dull shine as if the sky had pressed its thumb upon them. All morning, the weight of weather had collected. Without announcement, clouds traveling low and fast in layered herds, veils dragging their fringes across ridges the way an old banner brushes a wall in passing. Takeshi and Nobu walked with cloaks drawn close. Not for rain, none had fallen yet, but for the charged air that made sleeves whisper and hair lift. A prelude you could taste on the mouth like the memory of iron. The path tilted toward the north and did not hide the work ahead. It widened and narrowed by the will of rock, and every turn placed them under a sky that had forgotten how to be small. There were no birds at first, only the quiet industry of locusts shivering in the weed stems, their rhythm almost too thin to notice. Then crows appeared, 4, then 7, riding the underbelly of the cloud shelf as if pulled along by its slow machinery. A fox crossed their way, its coat winter dull, head low, moving with the consent of an animal that knows borders. Do not apply to it. Beyond that, only the long line of the borderlands, a paleness where the soil changed temperament, darker seams where stream beds waited for water, hummocks of scrub like punctuation marks in a sentence the land had not finished. Midday did not brighten so much as gather itself. Heat held close to the ground with the caution of a traveler avoiding notice, and every rustle of stalk against stalk sounded like documents being sorted. Nobu kept a pace behind and a little left, his eyes learning the horizon's grammar, the slightly darker wedge that was not a cloud but a stand of thorn, the brighter ribbon that was not water but a strip of pale reed, the sudden lifting of horses' heads in a far enclosure where men were not yet visible. Once a bearing pole lay in the ditch, scorched at one end, the rope stained in a color not fully surrendered by the last rain. The smell their wet earth braided with old smoke rose to meet them and fell again. They left it behind like a word that meant something elsewhere. Toward early afternoon, they climbed a low shoulder and found the first outpost hunched upon it, A fort of the border only in name, palisade of sharpened stakes set in a ditch, gate framed with warped beams. 2 watch platforms whose ladders had been mended twice more than their worth. Banners hung above the gate, torn into long tongues by the wind, color bleached into history. Ink traces remained upon them, enough to be read if the reader knew what to keep and what to forgive. Kensei's crest rendered by a careful hand, and later scoured by weather, beside it a newer cloth tied crudely to the same rope, bears the faint burned wing that had begun to appear across the province. 2 strokes crossing where a seal would sit if a seal had been wanted. The wind tugged at those shreds and made them speak a thin language to the hills. Guards stood within the gate in their winter allowances, plates hidden beneath plain coats, cords cinched to the next hole, helmet bowls dulled by weather to the color of old stone. One of them was coaxing a horse to accept the day. The animal, a big bay with a white strip like chalk on its nose, tossed and stamped, ears angled at the pressure in the air. It blew a thin stream of breath that smoked briefly, and then was taken by wind, and it set one forefoot down twice, as if sounding the ground for hollow places. The other horses in the small pen answered with snorts and shivers, hide rippling along the ribs in a private orchestration. A boy walked among them with a handful of straw. The straw went ignored. He stroked a flank instead, and in the stroke tried to convince calm to be contagious. The smell here was wet wood and iron, soaked fence posts, a neglected pail, old chains that had learned the weather by heart. Thunder rolled along the far ridges without committing, like drums carried from one practice yard to another and never struck for parade. Takeshi paused on the rise. The wind pressed his cloak against his ribs and then let it go, finding seams, testing knots. Nobu came up beside him and stood listening to the way the outpost breathed, short breaths. Shallow, the way a house inhales before a storm to spare its doors the surprise. What lies ahead? Nobu asked, voice kept small so the land would not feel challenged. Men, Takeshi said, not heaven. A sergeant at the gate watched them as a man watches weather that has already made up its mind. He did not call out. His hand rested on the rail, fingers blackened with oil from the gate's hinges. The banners above him spoke again in their narrow tongues. In the yard, a soldier tested the edge of a blade with his thumbnail and then set the blade aside to tie his sleeve tighter, as if knots could correct all errors. Rain had not begun, but existed everywhere as promise. Stones at the gate mouth had darkened around their edges in preparation. The first drops would find those circles and complete them. They walked on, under the torn banners and past the uneasy horses and the men who had learned the economy of watching without moving. No one stopped them. This was the border where questions had learned to conserve themselves. A bell rang once inside the outpost, a single flat note that was more reminder than alarm, and a clerk emerged with a bound roll of paper, looked at the sky, and went back in. The sound of his sandals on the boards stirred dust that rose, and then sat down again as if allowing the air its little experiment. Beyond the gate, the land stepped down in terraces of scrub and shale, each shelf offering a different wind. The path ran like a stitch between them, pulling edges together where they would have otherwise frayed. Thunder came closer, a longer roll, not angry but large. The kind of sound that sets a hand upon the shoulder of a hill and keeps it there. The smell of iron sharpened in the nose, and with it the damp sweetness of crushed plants. Somewhere a herder called in a dialect so old the words had forgotten they were words. Sheep answered by moving. Men far off shouted something else, and their voices did not carry. Only the act of shouting did. They stopped at a broken milestone, a squat stone with a wedge missing from its top, a groove worn by untold palms, lichen making a soft map upon it. Nobu touched the groove with the side of his hand and kept it. There, borrowing steadiness from the object that had steadied others. He watched the sky. A seam of lighter gray traveled beneath darker bands, moving as if pulled by ropes at the edges of vision. To the north, along the line where Kensei's authority had always turned thin, smoke rose in careful stacks, campfires arranged not to be seen and failing at secrecy because too many were needed. Are they many? Nobu asked. Enough. Takeshi said. They followed the path as it turned to flank a low knoll. On the far side, a border shrine sat stubbornly on its square of ground. Roof tiles ranked like soldiers who had been given a simple order and chosen to obey it carefully. The rope before its bell was frayed and stained by many hands. The bell itself was greened, its lip chipped. Inside, a shallow altar held a ceramics bowl for rice and a cup for water. Both were empty save for dust. Someone had recently wiped the dust with the cleanest part of a sleeve and left a small diagonal through the dullness, a courtesy to any god that might arrive without warning. A handful of paper prayer slips had been tacked under the eave. They had loosened at one corner, so they lifted and fell against the wood like fish mouths at the surface of a pond. Amid them, a square with 2 strokes crossed where a seal would. Soot burned lightly into the paper rather than inked, had been penned, then partially torn away. The torn edge had blackened at the fiber, as if heat had chosen that place because the hand had refused to. Nobu looked at Takeshi. There was no need to speak. Wind ran its fingers through the little flags again, making a sound like the idea of rain before rain exists. Takeshi placed his palm on the altar's edge, bowed his head enough to acknowledge the square of ground, and backed away. The shrine, arranged to be a room for the invisible, accepted and returned nothing. The first rain came as a fine drafting of dots, as if a hand had shaken ink off a brush across the land. Stones clicked under it, tiny reports. Leather darkened, cloth drank and became heavier. Sand composed itself to receive the storm more elegantly. Armor within the outposts gave their quiet speech. Water striking plate has a particular intimacy when it begins, and then those sounds dimmed as the wind shifted to meet the new air. Thunder flowered somewhere behind cloud and traveled down the long corridors of the valleys. They climbed another shelf and then another. The path tightened between 2 shoulders of rock and dropped briefly into a channel where water once rushed. In older seasons, here the smell of wet earth bloomed, that honest sweetness that makes even the sternest men forgive a day. And within it, the cleaner cutting line of iron. More vivid now, the stones had opened themselves. Nobu put his hand upon the wall of the channel as he passed. It was cool, and his fingers came away with a delicate skin of grit that he rubbed into nothing. A horse's cry traveled to them from somewhere they could not see. One answered, closer, and stamped, the hollow pop of hoof on wet board, then the duller knock of hoof on earth. The animal correcting its footing to keep from slipping into disaster. They found a ridge toward evening, not high but honest, a place a man would choose to set a watch. From it, the border country fell away in long folds to a basin formed by 3 low hills and a river that had decided to be lazy this summer, widening into a silver thought before it left. In that basin, dozens of fires took hold against wetness. They flared and then remembered their discipline, each one hooded with a makeshift brake, each one replenished reluctantly. The camp lay like an unwanted constellation, too many stars collected in one wrong corner of the sky. Around those fires men moved, made small by the scale of weather and made larger in it by how they behaved. Some bent to stoke, some stood to look upward, some tightened straps, some held hands to smoke, and watched the shape it made unfold and be taken. Tents leaned into the wind. A patchwork of stolen cloth and old canvas, dyed and faded, patched and stained. A corral had been built. In haste, posts not set deep enough. Horses within it marked the storm with lifted heads and ears, turned to find its origin. Their hides beaded with water, their tails swatting at a discomfort that had no single source. A handful of battered helmet bowls sat on a cart like bowls. After a poor wedding, spear points, some leaf-shaped and old, some too thin for truth, stood in a rack. A thicket lifted by hands that had learned the minimum required to keep such things vertical. On a central rise, a long staff had been planted and a strip of dark cloth fastened to it. The cloth bore the cross strokes of the wing, burned and cooled, ashless. When wind pulled it out, the device looked almost like writing and almost like a bird made by a child on a day of smoke. Nobu said nothing. The valley spoke for him, and what it said was a catalog of needs. Hunger moving in figures around the fire, cold trying to come closer through wet sleeves, fear braid wrapped with purpose. The thunder now marked time in the deep. Rain thickened, enough to make a sound on stone. Each drop that found armor added its syllable to a long poem the storm had been revising since noon. The smell of wet earth rose as if it had been waiting for sign. The smell of iron sharpened as if to say, I will be required whether asked politely or not. What do you see? Takeshi asked, not to test, but to align their eyes. Banners tied too quickly, Nobu said. Men who have borrowed armor that does not fit. Horses with good feet, stamming badly. Fires that want to be smaller. A river that will misbehave when told to work. And a hand I cannot yet see, Nobu said, warming itself at the edge. Takeshi's eyelids lowered in the smallest agreement. He moved his gaze along the valley's rim, where shadows layered under thorn. There, 100 paces beyond the outermost fire, another line declared itself, figures angled. Not desperate. Cloaks worn correctly in rain. Blades carried point low, as if conversation were still possible. Not all were ronin. Some had been soldiers until last month, and had kept the way a soldier stands when bored and waiting. They formed the rib of a fish around the central staff, the line subtly curved to hold weight. Dago's influence knew how to draw such shapes. The ridge took a longer breath. Wind pushed through the scrub with a hand that opened and closed, opened and closed. The clouds above changed their argument, their underside growing bruised dark. In places, pale in others. Lightning put a thin white line into a far hill and lifted it before letting go. Thunder followed, slower than the eye would expect, traveling into the bones and finding there the same corridors it had mapped among the rocks. Do we go down? Nobu asked simply. We wait, Takeshi said. For what? For the storm? To tell them what they already know, he said. For the river to answer? For the horses to say the rest. They stood together and listened as rain found the ridge in earnest, dots becoming lines, lines becoming sheets, until the world moved within a curtain's language. The border outpost behind them answered with a thump of gate and a murmur of men pulled closer into dry. Harness rang as buckles were tightened. Someone ran with a poncho across the yard, and the sound diminished into the general hush. Far across the basin, a drum took up a simple beat, as if to reassure those who needed reassurance that someone had brought a plan. Thunder mocked it kindly with a beat that had never needed practice. Water ran in new courses over old stone, drawing bright threads down the slope toward the river. The smell of wet grass rose like a blessing on the rough ground. Nobu's hair darkened and lay flat. A drop found his brow, paused in that small hesitation where skin tries to memorize it, then fell with regard upon his cheek. He did not wipe it away. He set his feet a little wider and lowered his center of gravity, the way a man stands when wind must be given something to work around. He will be there, Nobu said after a time, and in the words there was no question. Of identity, tucked, Takeshi said, where paper pretends to be weather. They watched the fires multiply because men could not tolerate their fear without something to tend. They watched the horses push to the leeward side of the corral and stand shoulder to shoulder until their heat improved matters. They watched. The river, unhurried even now, take the beginning of the rain without argument and widen to accept more. The wing on the staff stuttered in gusts and then made its horizontal again, as if it must proclaim equanimity to compel it. Will the outpost hold? Nobu asked, eyes flicking back once to the tired palisade. For tonight, Takeshi said, storms close gates better than men. What will they do when it clears? The same thing men always do, Takeshi said. Feed, test, regret. Repeat. The line did not sharpen. It lay upon the air as softly as the rain upon leather dot below. The shadow of movement thickened where the outer watchers had been. Orders moved among them, not shouted, but carried in hand and face. Someone pointed at the ridge once, twice, as if measuring its arrogance. They did not send anyone up. The storm had made a higher authority available, and even men who do not love. Authority can read when it has arrived. The thunder turned again and rolled into a low valley and out. The ridge under Takeshi's sandals vibrated in that exquisite way stones can, a reminder that the world carries sounds far more willingly than it carries any one man. Night lowered itself with unusual speed, as if assisting the storm in its work. The fires became more particular in the dark, showing their small characters, a hard blue near a damp stick, a clean bright at the edge of a dry split, a red bed where patience had made a home. The valley spread them like a diagram of unquiet. Lightning flashed again and for an instant made every wet surface honest. The curve of a helmet, the run of a rivulet down a breastplate, the slick back of a horse, its eye taking that light and holding it, then letting it go. In the echo, armor and stone spoke their brief speech as raindrops struck. A music so fine the ear tired at its counting and surrendered to general praise. South of the river's bend there, Nobu murmured, chin tilting. Empty ground, not empty, Takeshi said, kept. For whom? For the answer they think they want? Nobu nodded, not in agreement, but in comprehension of the kind of sentence that wants to be left alone. He pulled his cloak tighter at neck and wrists, squeezed water from the knot without changing its shape, and looked again at the valley. His breathing stayed low. He had learned to let silence speak to him. The boy's earlier need to attach words to a sight replaced by a steadier attention that allowed things to keep their names wherever they were. They stayed on the ridge until the back of the storm began to show itself, a slight loosening in the tight weave of rain, a pause between thunders that taught men the number 3 again, then 4, then 5. For a moment, the clouds thinned enough that the western edge let a paler gray through, and the land below brightened by the smallest shade. In that shade, the winged cloth strained toward them as if meaning to tear itself free and fly. It failed at the tier. Wind attended to it anew. A single horse broke from the corral then and circled twice, once with head high, once with head low, and returned to the group, not wiser but at least tired. The dog barked, the high, frustrated bark of a creature that knows danger but has never met a sword, and was shushed. Somewhere under a tent flap, someone lifted a cup and realized it had filled itself with rain. He drank anyway, held the cup out again to fill a second time, and offered it to the man next to him. "Do we light a fire?" Nobu asked finally. "No," Takeshi said. "Tonight we learn the shapes of their warmth." A breath later, the first true drop hit his cheek large, distinct, loyal to its own weight. It left a cool line down the muscle beside his jaw and vanished into the collar of his robe. He did not wipe it. He did not move forward. He did not retreat. He let the ridge keep him where it had kept others before him, those who measured and those who rushed both, and in that keeping he felt the province shift its balance. A finger's width toward the conflict that had been gathering in men rather than heaven, thunder spoke once more, wider and closer. The border outpost's torn banners cracked like old cloth doing their best. The smell of wet earth rose with the smoke of distant fires and met the iron tang cleanly, neither yielding. Horses stamped against the storm and then stilled. Rain, now sure of itself, ran upon stone and armor and wood, and the valley answered with the soft percussion of 1,000 small impacts. A lullaby for those who could sleep under any truth, and a sentence for those who could not. They stood, the master and the apprentice, on the ridge that made them look like a single mark in a book too large for most readers. The low campfires flickered in the darkness like bad stars, arranged by desire, held in place by fear. Above, the storm broke open, not in anger but in authority, and the world became the color of decision. Takeshi let the rain write its first line upon him and said nothing. The night accepted the weight of what is to come and closed around it with solemn care.